This is an introduction to Lockdown 1.3. This is a repeat of the first tutorial. There's no new information except it shows new parts of the UI. To use Lockdown, you have to follow the steps from 1 through 9 using the script in the plugin. The first step is the Precompose button. All this does is it's going to take your footage or your layer and precompose it into a new composition and ensure that the footage has the same resolution and frame rate as your main comp, because Lockdown won't work if the footage and composition are out of sync. It also ensures the speed of your clip is at 100% inside of that pre-comp. I'm going to skip that step for now. I'll apply Lockdown. There's an optional tracking filter, and actually this is less necessary than ever now. However, it can still be very good for small fine details. What this does is it aims to nullify shading changes in the shot by creating a high frequency contrast. You definitely want to be in 16-bit mode when you use this though, or it will create small levels of popping that will throw off the tracker. You can make minor adjustments to the blur radius to decide how small the filter is. This is just something you do by eye to make sure it looks like you can see these patterns clearly throughout. I'm going to minimize these effects. To create points, control click and drag, and that will create a grid of points. Alt click and drag to remove points. You can do this in a grid or just alt click them individually. You can control click to create points. When you're done placing your points, there's a button here, press to track points. And now we can evaluate the tracks. Probably the most important step in Lockdown is finding bad tracks and removing them. I'm trying to look here and I don't see too many issues. I see one pop up here. If we take a look, I'm going to select Lockdown and then select this point. And now this renders yellow. And when we play this, we can keep a better eye on it. And there is a pop. Right there. We have these buttons, delete backwards keyframes and delete forward keyframes. So I'm going to say that it probably tracks better forward in the shot than it did backward. I'm going to delete backward keyframes. And now you'll notice as I scroll backwards, it's no longer rendering. That point is gone. And it's not contributing incorrectly to the mesh that's being created. The most important step is filtering out bad tracks because you can't really compensate for it once you've stabilized and unstabilized. Sometimes you'll notice the playback is a little bit slow with Lockdown, and that's because we are waiting for UI interactions. If you want to hide your UI, you can hold Control Shift and hit H, and then the scrubbing will be significantly faster. For the record, with the composition selected, you can go to View, View Options, and that's this Layer Controls button that's toggled with Control Shift H, Command Shift H on Mac. So that needs to be on to actually interact with the plugin. If this is off, when you go to click and drag, it's just going to move this around. And this is something with all the plugins in After Effects. So if I go to Distort, Mesh Warp, I'm just going to toggle that back on with Control Shift H. You can see there's this whole control set here. And if I have Control Shift H off, which is the view options, now when I click and drag, those controls aren't there. So that's the thing, is that the Lockdown controls may be invisible and you can't see them, but the view option still has to be on to actually interact with Lockdown. So I'll just delete that mesh warp. And make sure that if you're toggling that on and off, you always have that view options on when you're trying to click and interact with Lockdown. And Lockdown also has to be selected. Sometimes you'll have difficulty with an object crossing the frame. So for example, this hand swipes past. If you have a point that's tracked here, I'm just going to control click and track this. For the record, I'm going to push forward and try to get rid of, okay, about here, I know that's where the track is probably going to fail. So I'm just going to set my out point and track this. And I'll select this point so we can focus on it. So that point gets lost a little bit in there. The way we can solve this is go to the frame where it's last correct, so that's right here, In forward one frame, it starts to go crazy because the shadow is covering it. And just press delete forward keyframes. And then towards the back end of this shot, I'm going to try to remember generally where this texture was. I'm just keeping an eye on it. And then I'm going to control click here and track this forward. Select this point and let's take a look at it. So this starts to get pushed by the hand on this frame. So I'm going to go here and delete backward keyframes. And we know that we probably want to merge this point with that other point. So we have a shortcut for that. Select this point on the frame that you want to begin the merge. And then shift select the next point. And they'll turn red, indicating that they're going to be merged within this red zone. So from here to there. And press merge points. That can be done with a little bit more finesse. I just wanted to explain the control. And I think I also saw another issue where this point went off. So let's move backwards and right about here. So I'm just going to delete all previous keyframes, backward keyframes, so that doesn't contribute to the mesh solve. So what do we do? How do we deal with this keyframe that is not going through the entire shot? Well, we actually have a button and you should always use it. It's called Interpolate Partial Tracks. And I'm just going to deselect this point so you can see what's happening. When these points are this light blue color, that means that these have actually been tracked. And as we scrub backwards, you'll notice now it's this dark blue color, which means there's no more tracking data on the point, and it's just following some of the nearby points. Same with this one up here. Another very important tracking method with Lockdown is tracking using Mocha. To track in Mocha, go to Effect, Boris Effects Mocha, and we'll use Mocha AE because I know all of you have it. Place it above Lockdown, that will make things easier later, and open Mocha. This isn't a tutorial for tracking in Mocha, but just for example's sake, I'm going to track right here. Here's the track. This isn't a Mocha tutorial. However, just know that in Mocha, these 4 corner points are what are actually going to get exported to Lockdown. Save this. To expose these points in Mocha, go to Tracking Data, Create Track Data, and use the gear icon to select the layer. This is the only one, so it's selected. And press OK, and you'll see there's kind of a little hover over there. I'm actually just going to delete this point, or I'll delete both of these points that were very close to the Mocha points, just so it's easier to see them when they come in. And then, with Lockdown, press this Mocha/Face Tracker import button. Now you can see these points are in Lockdown, and they're a cyan color. I'm just going to disable Mocha. So where are these points? If you double-click the U key, you can see all of the keyframes in the project, and these are part of the externalized point slots, meaning they're exposed keyframe tracks in Lockdown. They're not internal and saved within the plugin. The externalized points are intended to get points in and out of Mocha from different tracking systems or different animation. If you want to take any points out of Lockdown that have been tracked with Lockdown, just select them, and its keyframes are down here under 0.5. If you want, you can copy these points, paste them to the position of a null object, and use the tracking data elsewhere in After Effects. Just for example's sake, I'm going to delete this keyframe track here. And if you had tracked points outside of Lockdown, you can copy and paste those points in. Sometimes the points don't render immediately. This is a bug with Lockdown 1.3. Just press select all points, and that will force the render. Sorry about that. We will patch that out very soon. Before proceeding, I would highly recommend internalizing all points. Lockdown is just going to run smoother and faster when they're inside the plugin and not externalized keyframes. Select all points, internalize selected points. Now comes the fun part, which is actually building a mesh. We have an auto triangulate mesh button you can press. And you can see how lockdown is going to deform following the shirt. I noticed one pop here. I'm not sure how that happened. So I'm just going to select that, delete forward keyframes. And that point will follow along with the rest of the points. To delete bad edge connections, press Option and click. This looks like it did a pretty good job lining these points up along the collar. However, if for whatever reason it didn't, if it triangulated strangely, you can select a point and then Control or Command Shift click to manually draw connections for important geometry. The last important feature is mesh extension. Sometimes there are areas that are tricky to track, for example, next to this hand here. And you can create extension points that just follow along with the rest of the mesh. So to do that, hold down Control, Alt, Shift, and click. And you'll notice that it's light blue on the frame where it was created, and then it's that dark blue interpolated in following color for the rest of the frames. So I'm just going to place a few around this mesh. So keep in mind that these points are not actually tracked, so they're going to slip a little bit. But the point is, it just gives your mesh a little bit of extra reach. I'm going to auto triangulate to include these points. The mesh has been created. The next step is to stabilize it. Press Apply Mesh on this frame. Here's the stabilized mesh. I just went through and I found a few other pops and I cleaned those up. So again, just make sure that you clean up everything as much as you possibly can. When you stabilize, it should look really almost completely still, just like this, at least in the area where you want to apply graphics. You'll notice there's going to be a lot of slide around the edges, and that's because those interpolated keyframes are not actually tracked. And you should try to keep your graphics inside the tracked points as much as possible and not near the extensions. The extensions are more just for the edges of objects. Your mesh is applied. Moving on to step 8, which says return to lockdown script. Select the layer and press lockdown. When you play this back, things will look mostly the same. What this script does is you have your original footage on the bottom, it places it there, and then I'm just going to move this down to 50% opacity, just for example's sake. And then this layer above it is the stabilized pre-comp, except it's been tracked back on. Now let's go into here. This is the stabilized pre-comp that we were just looking at, and we have a still frame of the footage, just so you kind of remember which frame you applied the mesh on. Let's just press U. So there it is, there's that box indicator. I typically put in a marker, but that does that for you. And now when we put graphics in here, moving back to the main comp, your graphics are stuck to your footage. One issue you'll see is there's a slight black border around your stabilized pre-comp. Honestly, this is just a bug, but it's really, really easy to fix. If you go into your stabilized pre-comp, just create a new solid to mask inside of these edges. And you can see the problem is solved. We're sorry that bug exists, but it's pretty easy to deal with because when you're doing the masking, it's on a stabilized composition anyway, so you really just have to do a loose mask. Another option, if that's too much effort, would be to use a simple choker. And choke those edges in a little bit. That will have the same desired result. Or just shut this layer off entirely, because really all you need is the graphic coming through. So that's what this looks like here. And if we move back, that is still working. Let's solo this. And that's what it will look like. The main purpose for this stabilized pre-comp is one, for reference, but also because it can be useful to paint over. So even though this might not be the best example shot here, let's just take a look at what that would look like. I'm going to pre-compose this, moving all attributes into the new comp. And then I'm going to take the clone stamp tool. And let's just find a spot. Let's say for some reason that slightly dark spot, we just really don't want it. You can clone stamp over that. And when you play back, because this is stabilized, that clone stamp stays where it's supposed to stay. I just reverted my project back to using the graphic. To finish up this comp, what I would probably recommend is using the overlay transfer mode, even though this is more of a tutorial about lockdown and not about general compositing. Put on just the slightest blur. And maybe inside this composition on the graphic itself, roughen the edges. And just to be thorough, let's just talk about some of these other controls here. Minimum frame count for each track. That's just when we're doing a tracking point. If the track loses confidence and fails before this amount of frames are tracked, then it will be automatically deleted. Point radius, this is just how large the points render. So if I have render points turned on, and by the way, most of this is managed by the lockdown script, shutting these off at the appropriate time when you press the lockdown button or when you stabilize and so on. This can just be very useful on 4K or higher res footage so you can see these points. One last tip for working is that if you need to make adjustments after things have already been tracked, you probably want to do it on this instance of lockdown right here, the one on the outside of the stabilized comp. So for example, maybe I decide I want more quads in here than triangles. So I've made those edits to the mesh or to any of the tracking points, or I've added a new point, control clicking, tracking, connecting points on the mesh, etc. I'll shut off render points so this renders correctly. And then you can take the lockdown effect and copy it, and then move into the pre-comp and find that stabilized layer. Oh, whoops, I'd already pre-composed it behind the paint. It's in one further. Just remove lockdown from here, and then paste. And make sure it's set to stabilized. So now you have the mesh with all the tracking changes that you just made. And those have been pasted back into the stabilized comp. A lot of users also ask us how we deal with motion blur with lockdown. So I'll just try to find a frame where there might actually be some fast motion. Maybe right about there. There's not a lot of fast motion in this shot, but just for example's sake, the easiest way to do this is with Effect, Time, CC Force Motion Blur. Okay, you can see it here. This is actually adding the motion blur to the shot. It's very subtle, but it is there. I would probably not use Override Shutter Angle and just use whatever it was in the composition. And just for example's sake, I'm going to really crank that up to 720, which is a ridiculous and impossible shutter angle. Turn on the motion blur switch in the comp. And now CC Force Motion Blur allows motion blur there by resampling lockdown many times. Using CC Force Motion Blur is a little bit slow, So hopefully in the future we'll build in our own motion blur that moves faster, but for now this is a good solution. Thanks for watching. For more info, check out aescripts.com/lockdown.